The Arizona desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast expanse of red rock, sage, and survival. 10-year-old Rose McCarthy had learned to read this landscape the way other children read books. She knew which plants held water in their roots, where scorpions hid during the heat of the day, and how to navigate by the distinctive shapes of distant mesas. These were not skills taught in schoolrooms, but lessons learned from necessity in a land that forgave no mistakes. Rose lived at the Canyon Ridge trading post with the Hendersons, a middle-aged couple who had taken her in 2 years ago after her parents died from illness during the journey west. Thomas Henderson was a fair man who traded honestly with everyone who came through his doors, whether they were ranchers, prospectors, soldiers, or the occasional Apache who ventured this far from the reservation. His wife Martha was practical and kind, though worry lines had deepened around her eyes as tensions in the territory grew. Worse, the trading post sat at a crucial crossroads, where the main trail split toward Tucson in one direction and the mining settlements in another. It was built partially into a rock face for protection from both weather and potential attacks, with thick adobe walls and small windows. Behind the main building, a series of natural caves provided storage for goods and shelter during dust storms. Rose's daily chores included fetching water from the spring a quarter-mile away, tending the small garden they maintained in the shade of the rocks, and helping Martha with the endless tasks of cooking, cleaning, and managing inventory. But Rose's favorite responsibility was caring for the chickens and the old mule named Stubborn, who lived up to his name with remarkable consistency. It was during one of her trips to check the animal pens that Rose first noticed something unusual. The chickens were agitated, clucking nervously and refusing to settle. Stubborn's ears were pointed toward a cluster of rocks about 50 yards from the trading post, and his nostrils flared as if catching an unfamiliar scent. Rose approached the rocks carefully, remembering Thomas's warnings about rattlesnakes and other dangers. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and heat waves shimmered across the desert floor. As she moved closer, she heard something that made her freeze. It was barely audible, a soft groan of pain that could have been mistaken for wind through the rocks. Her heart pounded as she peered around a large boulder. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. A man lay partially hidden in a narrow crevice between rocks, his body positioned to take advantage of the meager shade. He was Apache. That much was clear from his clothing and the distinctive way his long black hair was tied. Blood stained his shirt along his left side, and his leg was twisted at an angle that suggested injury. Rose knew she should run back to the trading post immediately. The relationship between settlers and Apache had grown increasingly hostile over the past year. There had been attacks on both sides, retaliations and counter-retaliations that left everyone on edge. The army had intensified patrols, and many Apache had been forced onto reservations where conditions were harsh and supplies inadequate. But as Rose stood there, frozen between fear and something else she could not quite name, the warrior's eyes opened. They were dark and intelligent, filled with pain but also with a sharp awareness. He looked directly at her, and in that moment Rose saw something that surprised her. He was afraid too, not of her specifically, but of his situation, of his vulnerability, of dying alone in these rocks. The warrior made no threatening move. He simply watched her, his breathing shallow and labored. Rose noticed that his weapons, if he had carried any, were nowhere visible. His injuries appeared several days old. The blood dried and crusted. He must have been here for some time, hidden and suffering. Rose's mind raced. If she told Thomas and Martha, they would likely contact the army. The warrior would be captured, and given the current climate, his fate would not be kind. Wounded Apache warriors were viewed with particular suspicion, assumed to be returning from raids. But Rose had heard Thomas talk about the desperation that drove such conflicts. She had heard him say that hungry people did desperate things, that the reservation system was broken, and that there were no heroes in this situation, only survivors trying to make impossible choices. She made a decision that would change everything. Without speaking, she turned and walked back toward the trading post, her mind already forming a plan. She would need to be careful, methodical, and above all, secret. That evening after dinner, Rose volunteered to do the dishes alone so Martha could rest her aching back. While the older woman gratefully accepted and Thomas reviewed his ledgers, Rose carefully wrapped cornbread and dried meat in a cloth. She filled a small canteen with water, hiding it beneath her apron. When she announced she needed to check on the chickens one final time before bed, neither Thomas nor Martha thought anything unusual about it. Rose often fussed over the animals, treating them like pets rather than livestock. The desert night had brought cooler temperatures, but also darkness so complete that stars blazed overhead like scattered diamonds. Rose moved carefully, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. She had brought a small lantern but kept it shuttered, allowing only the thinnest beam to guide her steps. She found the warrior exactly where she had left him. His eyes opened at her approach, widening slightly in surprise when he saw she had returned. Rose knelt a safe distance away and placed the food and water on a flat rock between them. She pushed it toward him slowly, her hands visible and unthreatening. The warrior struggled to sit up, pain evident in every movement. He reached for the water first, drinking deeply but carefully, as if rationing even this precious gift. Then he took the food, eating slowly despite what must have been intense hunger. Rose watched him, her young mind trying to reconcile the stories she had heard about dangerous warriors with the suffering man before her. He did not look particularly fierce at the moment. He looked exhausted, hurt, and profoundly alone. When he finished eating, the warrior looked at her directly. He spoke in a language she did not understand, his voice rough from lack of use. The words were soft, and Rose sensed they were meant as thanks. She nodded, acknowledging his gratitude. Then Rose did something that surprised even herself. She began to speak quietly, telling him about her day, about the chickens and Stubborn the mule, about the dust storm that had blown through last week. She spoke as much to comfort herself as him, filling the desert silence with the sound of a human voice. The warrior listened, his expression unreadable but attentive. Perhaps he understood some English, or perhaps he simply appreciated the attempt at connection. When Rose finally stood to leave, he raised one hand in what might have been a gesture of peace or farewell. Over the next week, Rose established a careful routine. Each evening she brought food and water, always watching to ensure she was not observed. The warrior's condition slowly improved. His wounds appeared to be healing, though his leg remained a concern. He began to speak a few words of English, teaching Rose phrases in Apache in return. She learned his name was Nashota, which meant twin, though he never explained if he actually had a twin or if there was another story behind the name. He had been separated from his group during a skirmish with army scouts, injured and forced to hide while his companions fled. He had been slowly making his way back toward the reservation when fever and pain had finally forced him to take shelter. Rose told him about her life, about her parents who had dreamed of starting fresh in Arizona, about their deaths, and about the Hendersons who had taken her in when she had no one. She talked about her fears and hopes, about missing her mother's voice and her father's laugh. These conversations happened in whispers and broken language, but they created an unlikely bond. Nashota treated Rose with gentle respect, seeming to understand the courage it took for her to help him. He began to teach her practical skills, showing her which plants could treat injuries, how to move silently, and how to read signs in the desert that most people missed. But their secret could not last forever. One evening, as Rose approached the rocks with her nightly offerings, she heard voices. Thomas and Martha were arguing near the trading post, their words carrying across the quiet desert air. Martha had noticed food going missing. She had seen Rose slipping out at odd hours. Concern had turned to suspicion, and they were planning to follow her the next evening. Rose's blood ran cold. She hurried to Nashota and explained the situation in urgent whispers. He understood immediately. He told her that he was strong enough to travel now, that he would leave before dawn and make his way back to his people. He thanked her for her kindness and told her that her parents would be proud of the person she was becoming. Then Nashota did something unexpected. He removed a small leather pouch from around his neck and pressed it into Rose's hands. Inside was a turquoise stone carved with intricate symbols. He explained in his limited English that it was a protection charm blessed by his grandmother who had great wisdom. He told Rose to keep it safe, and that if she ever needed help to show it to his people. They would know what it meant. Rose wanted to protest, to insist he keep it, but Nashota's expression was firm. He had made his decision. As the first hints of dawn colored the eastern sky, Rose watched him climb carefully out of his hiding place. He moved with a slight limp but with determination. At the ridgeline, he turned back once, raising his hand in farewell. Rose raised hers in return, tears streaming down her face. She had saved his life, but he had given her something equally precious. He had treated her with respect, had seen her as capable and brave, had trusted her with his story and his gratitude. As she walked back to the trading post, the turquoise stone warm in her pocket, Rose did not yet know that this act of compassion would be remembered. She did not know that Nashota would return to his people and tell them about the small girl with red hair who had risked everything to show kindness to an enemy. She did not know that this story would be shared around fires, passed from person to person, and that her name would be spoken with honor among people she had never met. All she knew was that she had done what felt right, even when it was dangerous. And somehow that knowledge felt like enough. 3 weeks passed after Nashota disappeared into the desert dawn. Life at the Canyon Ridge trading post returned to its familiar rhythms, but Rose felt changed in ways she could not fully articulate. She moved through her daily tasks with the same efficiency, but her mind often wandered to those whispered conversations in the rocks, to the lessons Nashota had taught her, and to the weight of the turquoise stone she kept hidden in a small cloth bag beneath her mattress. The Hendersons had never discovered her secret visits. Martha's suspicions had faded when the missing food stopped disappearing, and Thomas had been too occupied with increasingly troubling news to pay much attention to Rose's evening routines. That news dominated every conversation at the trading post now. Tensions throughout the territory had escalated dramatically. Army patrols had been doubled after a supply wagon was attacked near the mining camps. In retaliation, soldiers had raided an Apache camp, claiming they were searching for stolen goods. The official report stated minimal casualties, but travelers brought different stories. Whispers of families displaced, of supplies confiscated, of anger building like storm clouds on the horizon. Thomas heard these accounts from the diverse stream of people who passed through his trading post. There were ranchers worried about their livestock, miners concerned about the security of their claims, and soldiers who spoke carefully when in uniform, but more honestly after a few drinks. Each group saw the conflict through their own lens, and Thomas tried to remain neutral, continuing to trade fairly with everyone. But neutrality was becoming increasingly difficult. Some settlers had begun pressuring Thomas to refuse service to any Apache who ventured near the trading post. They argued that providing supplies to potential enemies was tantamount to betrayal. Thomas had refused, pointing out that trade was his livelihood and that he would not judge a person's intent based on their heritage. This principled stance had cost him some customers but earned him respect from others. It also meant that when a small group of Apache women occasionally came to trade handmade baskets and pottery for flour and cloth, they knew they would be treated with dignity at Canyon Ridge. Rose watched these exchanges with careful attention. She studied the faces of the Apache women, wondering if any of them knew Nashota, if they had heard the story of the wounded warrior and the red-haired girl. But she never asked, never revealed her secret, understanding instinctively that some knowledge was safer kept hidden. Summer's heat intensified, turning the desert into a furnace during midday hours. Rose developed new routines to cope with the temperature, working early in the morning and late in the evening, resting in the relative cool of the adobe building during the worst heat. It was during one of these afternoon rest periods that everything changed. Rose was helping Martha sort through a recent shipment of fabric when they heard the sound of approaching horses. Multiple horses moving fast. Thomas immediately went to the window, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle he kept near the door. What they saw made Rose's stomach clench with fear. A group of riders was approaching, but not from the main trail. They came from the direction of the hills, moving in a loose formation that suggested urgency, rather than casual travel. As they drew closer, Rose could see their uniforms. Army scouts accompanied by several soldiers. Thomas stepped outside, Martha following closely. Rose moved to the doorway, staying partially hidden but watching intently. The lead scout was a lean man with a weathered face and cold eyes. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his movements aggressive and impatient. The conversation that followed would replay in Rose's mind for days afterward. The scout, who introduced himself as Lieutenant Crawford, demanded to know if Thomas had seen or traded with any Apache in recent weeks. Thomas answered honestly that a few women had come to trade, as they had done peacefully for years. Crawford's expression hardened. He stated that they were tracking a warrior who had escaped from a skirmish, someone they believed had been hiding in this area. The man was considered dangerous, and anyone providing aid or shelter could be charged with treason against the United States. Thomas stood his ground, explaining that he had seen no wounded warriors, that his trading post was open, but not a hiding place for fugitives. Crawford did not seem satisfied. He ordered his men to search the area, including the storage caves behind the trading post. Rose felt panic rising in her chest. Although Nashota was long gone, evidence of her visits might still remain. A scrap of cloth she had used for bandages, the flat rock where she had left food, any number of small signs that an observant tracker might notice. The soldiers spread out, searching methodically. Rose watched from the doorway, her hands gripping the wooden frame so tightly her knuckles turned white. Martha noticed her distress and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, misinterpreting Rose's fear as general anxiety about the soldiers' presence. One of the younger soldiers approached the rock formation where Nashota had hidden. Rose held her breath as he examined the area. She saw him notice something, saw him bend down to pick up what looked like a piece of leather cord. He called to Crawford, who strode over immediately. The lieutenant examined the cord, then surveyed the rocks with renewed interest. He noted the protected crevice, the strategic position that offered both concealment and a view of the trading post. He turned to Thomas with accusation clear in his expression. Thomas maintained his innocence, stating truthfully that he had no knowledge of anyone hiding in those rocks. Crawford studied him for a long moment, then shifted his gaze to Martha and finally to Rose. His eyes lingered on the young girl, something calculating in his expression. He asked Rose directly if she had seen anything unusual near those rocks in recent weeks. Rose felt Martha's hand tighten on her shoulder. She knew she had a choice in this moment. She could tell the truth and potentially bring terrible consequences, or she could lie convincingly. Rose looked Crawford in the eye and shook her head, her voice steady despite her racing heart. She told him she collected eggs from the chickens daily, but had never seen anyone hiding in the rocks. The lie felt heavy on her tongue, but she told it without hesitation. Crawford did not seem entirely convinced, but he had no evidence to contradict her. After several more tense minutes, he remounted his horse and informed Thomas that they would be posting regular patrols in the area. He warned that anyone caught aiding Apache fugitives would face severe consequences. Then the soldiers departed, leaving dust and unease in their wake. That night, Thomas sat Rose down for a serious conversation. He explained that the situation in the territory was deteriorating rapidly. There were rumors of forced relocations, of Apache families being moved to distant reservations far from their traditional lands. There was talk of warriors gathering in the mountains, preparing for a final stand against encroachment. Thomas made Rose promise to be extremely careful, to stay close to the trading post, and to report anything unusual immediately. He said these things out of love and concern, never suspecting that Rose had already been more deeply involved than he could imagine. Rose made the promise, even as guilt gnawed at her conscience. She had never lied to Thomas before, had never kept secrets of such magnitude, but she also knew with certainty that surprised her that she had made the right choice. Nashota had been no threat to them. He had been a wounded man seeking survival, and she had offered basic human compassion. Still, the lieutenant's visit had shaken her. The intensity of the search, the determination to find and punish, suggested that the warrior's escape had significance beyond a single skirmish. Rose wondered what Nashota's story really was, what he might have witnessed or done that made the army so determined to capture him. As weeks passed, the atmosphere throughout the territory grew heavier. Trade at the Canyon Ridge post decreased as people became more cautious about travel. The Apache women who had occasionally come to trade stopped appearing entirely. Thomas worried about finances, about their ability to sustain the post if tensions continued to escalate. Then came the day that changed everything. Rose was working in the garden one morning when she heard Martha scream. She ran toward the trading post to find Martha standing frozen, pointing toward the eastern trail. A massive dust cloud rose in the distance, far larger than any normal traffic would create. Thomas emerged with his rifle, his face pale. The dust cloud was moving toward them, and as it grew closer they could see what caused it. Riders, dozens of them. Perhaps more than 100, all moving together in a coordinated mass. Rose's first thought was that the army was mounting some massive operation, but as the riders grew closer, she realized her mistake. These were not soldiers. These were Apache warriors, more than she had ever seen assembled in one place. Riding with purpose toward the Canyon Ridge trading post, Martha grabbed Rose, pulling her toward the trading post's reinforced door. Thomas stood his ground outside, his rifle ready but not raised, his face a mask of confused determination. They were hopelessly outnumbered. If this was an attack, they had no chance of survival, but something seemed wrong about the formation. The warriors were not approaching with weapons drawn or with the chaos of a raid. They moved in organized lines, and as they drew close enough for details to be visible, Rose saw something that made her heart stop. At the front of the massive group, riding a paint horse with distinctive white markings, was Nashota. His leg had healed and he sat straight and strong. But it was not just his presence that shocked Rose. It was what the entire group carried. Every warrior held something white. Cloth strips, pieces of fabric, some with hastily attached feathers or beads. These were not weapons. These were flags of truce, symbols of peaceful intent. This enormous gathering had not come for war, they had come for her. The moment seemed to stretch into eternity, as the massive group of Apache warriors brought their horses to a halt approximately 50 yards from the trading post. Dust swirled around them, creating an almost dreamlike haze in the morning sunlight. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the occasional snort of a horse or the creak of leather saddles. Thomas Henderson stood motionless, his rifle still lowered, but his body tense with the alertness of a man facing the unknown. Martha had pulled Rose behind her, one arm wrapped protectively around the girl's shoulders. Rose could feel the woman's heart racing, could sense the terror that gripped both of her guardians. But Rose felt something different. As she peered around Martha's shoulder and saw Nashota at the front of the assembly, she felt not fear but recognition. And something else, something that made her carefully extract herself from Martha's protective grip and step forward. Martha tried to pull her back, whispering urgent warnings, but Rose gently freed herself and walked to stand beside Thomas. She placed her small hand on his arm, and the gesture seemed to steady him somehow. He glanced down at her, confusion evident in his expression, but he did not order her back inside. Nashota dismounted slowly, deliberately, making his movements visible and non-threatening. Two older warriors flanked him, also dismounting. One was clearly a man of significant importance, his clothing adorned with intricate beadwork and his bearing radiating authority. The other was equally distinguished, his face weathered by decades of sun and experience, carrying a ceremonial staff wrapped with feathers and colored cloth. The three men walked forward, stopping at a respectful distance from Thomas and Rose. Nashota spoke first, his English much improved from their whispered conversations weeks ago. He addressed Thomas directly, introducing himself and the two leaders beside him. One was called Cochise, a name Thomas recognized immediately as belonging to a respected chief. The other was introduced as Geronimo, a medicine man and warrior whose reputation had spread throughout the territory. Thomas's hand tightened on his rifle, though he kept it pointed at the ground. His voice was steady as he asked what they wanted, though Rose could hear the underlying tremor of a man trying to maintain composure in an impossible situation. Nashota's response was careful and formal. He explained that they had come to honor a debt, to acknowledge a kindness shown when it should not have been possible. He gestured toward Rose, and suddenly all eyes were on the small red-haired girl standing beside the trader. Rose felt her face flush, but she stood tall, remembering the courage Nashota had shown during his own vulnerability. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small leather pouch containing the turquoise stone. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it, revealing the carved charm. Nashota's expression softened when he saw it. He spoke to the chiefs in Apache, gesturing to Rose and to the stone. The older warriors listened intently, occasionally asking questions that Nashota answered. Rose caught fragments of the conversation, words she had learned during those nights by the rocks, and she understood that he was telling them her story. Thomas looked down at Rose with dawning comprehension and shock. Martha had emerged from the trading post doorway, her fear temporarily overcome by confusion and curiosity. The pieces were coming together for both of them. The mystery of the missing food, Rose's evening absences, the evidence Crawford's soldiers had found in the rocks. When Nashota finished speaking, Cochise stepped forward. His English was heavily accented but clear. He addressed Rose directly, and his words carried the weight of formal ceremony. He stated that Nashota had told them about the child, who had risked safety and family, to show mercy to a wounded enemy. He said that such courage and compassion should be recognized, that their people honored those who acted with integrity, even when no one was watching. Geronimo added his voice, speaking of how Rose's actions had reminded them that goodness could exist anywhere, in any heart, regardless of the conflicts between peoples. He said that the girl had treated Nashota not as an enemy, but as a human being in need, and that this simple act of humanity had profound meaning. Thomas finally found his voice, though it cracked with emotion. He asked directly if Rose had been helping a fugitive warrior without their knowledge. His tone carried hurt alongside shock, the pain of discovering that the child he had sheltered had kept such a dangerous secret. Rose turned to face him, tears welling in her eyes but her voice steady. She admitted everything. She explained how she had found Nashota injured and dying, how she had been unable to simply walk away and let him perish. She described the nightly visits, the whispered conversations, the gradual healing. She apologized for the deception, but stated clearly that she would make the same choice again. Martha had moved to stand beside Thomas, and Rose saw conflicting emotions cross both their faces. Anger at the risk she had taken, fear for what might have happened, but also something else, a reluctant understanding, perhaps even a glimmer of pride at the moral courage their foster daughter had demonstrated. The moment was interrupted by the sound of more horses approaching from the opposite direction. Everyone turned to see Lieutenant Crawford and a patrol of soldiers cresting the ridge to the east. They had apparently been doing their regular sweep, and now found themselves facing a sight that must have seemed like their worst nightmare realized. Crawford's hand immediately went to his sidearm as he took in the massive gathering of Apache warriors surrounding the trading post. His men spread into a defensive formation, rifles raised. The lieutenant shouted for Thomas to get away from the hostiles, his voice carrying panic poorly disguised as authority. Thomas raised his hand, calling back that there was no attack, that this was a peaceful gathering. But Crawford was not listening. He ordered the Apache to disperse immediately, threatening military action if they did not comply. The atmosphere shifted dangerously. The Apache warriors, who had remained calm and still, now showed signs of agitation. Horses stamped nervously. Hands moved closer to weapons that had deliberately been kept sheathed or holstered. The white flags of truce seemed suddenly fragile, inadequate protection against misunderstanding and fear. Rose felt the situation spiraling toward disaster. She saw Crawford's finger moving toward his gun, saw the warriors tensing, saw Thomas trying desperately to position himself between the two groups. In that moment, she made a decision that would later seem either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. She walked directly toward Lieutenant Crawford, moving with deliberate slowness, her hands visible and empty except for the small leather pouch. She called out to him, her young voice carrying across the tense silence, asking him to listen before acting. Crawford's eyes widened as the small girl approached. He ordered her to stop to get back, but Rose continued walking until she stood directly in front of his horse. She held up the turquoise stone, her hand steady despite her racing heart. She told Crawford the entire story in clear, ringing words. She explained how she had found Nashota wounded, how she had cared for him secretly, how he had taught her and treated her with kindness. She described his departure and the gift of the protection charm. She stated that these warriors had not come for violence, but to honor a debt and acknowledge an act of compassion. Rose then said something that would be repeated in accounts of this day for generations. She told Crawford that if showing mercy to suffering was treason, then she was guilty. She said that if treating another human being with basic kindness made her an enemy of the state, then she would accept that judgment, but she would not apologize for choosing compassion over cruelty, humanity over hate. The silence that followed her words was profound. Crawford sat frozen on his horse, his hand still on his weapon, but his face showing an internal struggle. His men waited for orders, looking between their lieutenant, the small, defiant girl, and the massive gathering of Apache warriors, who had come not to fight but to honor this child's courage. Cochise moved forward slowly. Positioning himself near Rose, he spoke in English for everyone to hear. He stated that his people had endured terrible injustices, that they had lost land, family, and dignity. He acknowledged that there had been violence on both sides, pain that ran deep. But he said that Rose had reminded them that individual actions still mattered, that one person's choice to do right could carry more weight than 100 weapons. He proposed something unprecedented. He suggested that Rose's actions should be seen as an example of what was possible when people looked past uniforms and heritage to see shared humanity. He did not ask for peace, knowing that such negotiations were far beyond this moment. But he asked for acknowledgement, for recognition that honor existed on both sides of the conflict. Geronimo added his voice, speaking of the old ways that honored courage regardless of its source. He stated that among his people, Rose would be given a name that meant small one with a large heart, and that this name would be remembered in their stories. Thomas finally stepped forward, positioning himself beside Rose. His voice was thick with emotion as he addressed both Crawford and the Apache leaders. He stated that Rose was under his protection, that she had acted from the innocence and goodness that adults often lost. He said that if there were consequences for her actions, he would share them, but he would not allow her to be punished for showing mercy. Martha joined them, forming a small cluster of solidarity. Her fear had transformed into fierce protectiveness. She declared that Rose was family, and family stood together regardless of mistakes or misjudgments. Crawford found himself facing an impossible situation. He had no orders for dealing with a child who had helped a wounded warrior out of pure compassion. He had no protocol for responding to a peaceful gathering of hundreds who had come not to fight, but to honor that child. The rulebook he operated from had no entry for this moment. After several tense minutes, Crawford made his decision. He stated that he would report the situation to his commanding officer, that there would need to be an official response. But he ordered his men to stand down, acknowledging that no immediate threat existed. He warned that this incident would have repercussions, but for now, he would not interfere with what he termed an unprecedented diplomatic situation. The lieutenant and his patrol withdrew to a nearby ridge, maintaining observation but reducing the immediate tension. As they departed, Rose felt her legs suddenly weaken, the weight of what she had just done crashing over her. Thomas caught her as she swayed, lifting her into his arms despite her 10 years. Holding her as he had when she first came to them, small and grieving and alone. Nashota approached once more, speaking quietly to Thomas. He explained that the gathering would disperse now, that their purpose had been achieved. They had witnessed Rose's courage, had seen her family stand beside her, and had shown that honor recognized honor regardless of the boundaries humans drew between themselves. Before leaving, Nashota knelt before Rose one final time. He thanked her again, this time not just for saving his life but for reminding his people that hope existed. He told her that she would always have friends among the Apache, that the protection she had shown him would be returned many-fold if she ever needed it. One by one, the warriors mounted their horses. Cochise and Geronimo each offered gestures of respect, acknowledging Thomas and Martha as well as Rose. Then, with the same organized coordination they had shown arriving, the massive gathering began to disperse, breaking into smaller groups that headed in different directions across the desert. As the dust settled and the sound of hoofbeats faded, the 3 people who made up the Canyon Ridge Trading Post's family stood together in stunned silence. The morning sun climbed higher, promising another scorching day. But for Rose, Martha, and Thomas, everything had changed. They had witnessed something that seemed impossible in these times of conflict and mistrust. They had seen hundreds come not for war, but for a child who had whispered kindness to a wounded warrior and set in motion a chain of events that no one could have predicted. And in that moment, standing together as the desert returned to its usual quiet, They understood that sometimes the bravest acts were the simplest ones, and the most profound changes began with a single choice to do right when no one was watching. The days following what locals would come to call the gathering passed in a strange state of suspended normalcy. Life at the Canyon Ridge trading post continued with its usual rhythms. Chickens needed feeding, inventory required organizing, travelers needed supplies, yet everything felt fundamentally different. The air itself seemed changed, charged with the lingering energy of that extraordinary morning. Thomas and Martha had sat Rose down that first evening for a long, difficult conversation. They expressed their shock and hurt at her deception, made her understand the danger she had placed not only herself but their entire livelihood in. Martha cried while explaining how terrified she had been, how the thought of losing Rose was unbearable. Thomas struggled to find words that balanced discipline with understanding, finally settling on making Rose promise never to keep such dangerous secrets again. But they also did something unexpected. After the initial shock and fear had been processed, after the lectures and tears and explanations, Thomas told Rose that what she had done required a kind of moral courage many adults never achieved. He did not condone the deception or the risk, but he acknowledged that her instinct to help someone suffering was fundamentally right, even if the circumstances made it complicated. Martha added that Rose's parents would have been proud of her compassion, even while being terrified by her recklessness. The older woman hugged Rose tightly and whispered that family meant standing together through mistakes and triumphs alike, and that nothing Rose did would ever change their love for her. These conversations helped, but Rose still struggled with complex feelings. She was proud of what she had done, yet guilty about the lies. She felt validated by the Apache warrior's acknowledgement, yet anxious about what repercussions might still come. The turquoise stone, which she now wore on a cord around her neck, hidden beneath her dress, felt simultaneously like a badge of honor and a target painted on her back. The official response came 3 days after the gathering. A different officer arrived, a Captain Williams who was older and carried himself with more measured authority than Lieutenant Crawford. He interviewed everyone separately, Thomas, Martha, Rose, and even some of the travelers who had witnessed parts of the incident. Captain Williams spoke with Rose for over an hour, asking detailed questions about her interactions with Nashota. His tone was neither accusatory nor friendly, simply professional. He seemed genuinely interested in understanding what had motivated a 10-year-old girl to help an enemy warrior, what their conversations had contained, and what the gathering had actually represented. Rose answered honestly, no longer having any reason to hide. She described finding Nashota injured, making the decision to help, and the nightly visits that had followed. She explained the lessons he had taught her, the stories they had shared, and the respect with which he had treated her. She admitted her fear when the gathering appeared, but described how Nashota's presence had helped her understand their peaceful intent. When the interview concluded, Captain Williams sat back and studied Rose thoughtfully. He told her something she had not expected. He said that what she had done was technically illegal under current territorial law regarding aid to hostile tribes. However, he acknowledged that prosecuting a child for an act of compassion would be politically complicated and morally questionable. He stated that the army had no interest in making Rose into either a criminal or a martyr. The captain's unofficial advice was for the family to maintain low profiles, to avoid discussing the incident publicly, and to understand that tensions remained high throughout the territory. He warned that not everyone would view Rose's actions as favorably as some might, and that discretion would be their best protection. He then departed with a curt nod, leaving behind more questions than answers about what official stance the military would ultimately take. Word of the gathering spread quickly throughout the territory despite the captain's advice about discretion. Travelers carried the story from town to town, each retelling adding embellishments until Rose wasn't sure which versions were accurate anymore. Some accounts painted her as a saint-like figure who had single-handedly prevented a massacre. Others portrayed her as a foolish child whose actions had endangered settlers. The truth, as usual, lay somewhere between the extremes. The impact on the trading post's business was immediate and divided. Some customers stopped coming entirely, viewing any association with someone who had helped the Apache as betrayal. These were typically the more recent settlers, People who had come west with rigid ideas about civilization versus savagery, us versus them. But others began making special trips to Canyon Ridge specifically because of what had happened. These were often older frontiersmen, people who had lived in the territory long enough to understand its complexities. They came to shake Thomas's hand, to tell Rose that courage came in many forms, and to express hope that perhaps her simple act might plant seeds for eventual understanding. One particular visitor arrived on a hot afternoon 2 weeks after the gathering. He was an elderly man who introduced himself as Samuel Whitehorse, though his weathered features and long grey braids suggested this was not his birth name. He explained that he had been raised Apache, but adopted by a missionary family as a child, living between both worlds for over 60 years. Samuel asked permission to speak with Rose privately. After Thomas and Martha agreed, albeit reluctantly, the old man and the young girl sat together in the shade of the trading post's porch. What he told her would help Rose understand the larger significance of what she had done. Samuel explained that the Apache people were facing their darkest hours, forced onto inadequate reservations, stripped of their traditional ways of life, watching their children die from diseases and malnutrition. Many felt their entire world was ending. In such times, hope became the scarcest resource, more valuable than food or water or ammunition. Nashota's story, Samuel said, had traveled through the Apache communities like wildfire through dry grass. The tale of the red-haired child who showed mercy when she had no reason to, who risked punishment to feed a wounded enemy, who stood before armed soldiers and hundreds of warriors to defend what she believed was right. This story had given people something they desperately needed. It reminded them that goodness still existed, that individual choices still mattered, that perhaps their children's children might live in a different world than the one currently consuming them. Samuel told Rose that Cochise and Geronimo had taken enormous risks, bringing so many warriors together for a peaceful gathering. The army could have interpreted it as preparation for attack. Other Apache factions could have seen it as weakness. But both leaders believed that acknowledging Rose's courage was important enough to take those risks. They needed their people to see that honor transcended tribal boundaries, that the values they held sacred, courage, compassion, keeping one's word, existed among all peoples. The old man's words helped Rose understand that her actions had rippled far beyond what she could have imagined. She had simply tried to help someone suffering. She hadn't been thinking about peace negotiations or cultural understanding or symbolic gestures. She had just seen a person in need and responded with basic human kindness. Yet that simple choice had become something larger, had been woven into narratives that both Apache and settlers were telling themselves about who they were and what was possible. Rose felt the weight of this responsibility, but also a growing understanding that she couldn't control how others interpreted or used her story. All she could control was continuing to act with integrity. As summer faded into fall, life at Canyon Ridge gradually stabilized into a new normal. The initial chaos of attention subsided, though the trading post remained a topic of conversation throughout the territory. Rose returned to her regular routines, though she noticed subtle changes in how people treated her. Some showed exaggerated respect, others obvious discomfort. She missed the anonymity of simply being a child doing chores. One cool October evening, as Rose was closing up the chicken coop, she noticed movement on the western ridge. Her heart jumped, old fears momentarily resurging. But as the figure approached, she recognized the distinctive gait and bearing. It was Nashota, alone this time, riding slowly with his hands clearly visible. Rose ran to alert Thomas, who emerged with his rifle but kept it lowered. Nashota dismounted at a respectful distance and called out a greeting. Thomas responded cautiously, asking what brought him back. The warrior explained that he had something to deliver, a message and a gift from his people. Nashota approached and handed Thomas a beautifully crafted leather document case. Inside was a piece of tanned hide with elaborate pictographs painted in natural dyes. Samuel Whitehorse had to be summoned from his small cabin 5 miles away to properly translate, but the message was clear even before his arrival. The pictographs told a story. They showed a small figure with distinctively colored hair finding a wounded warrior. They depicted her bringing food and water, sitting beside him in friendship. They showed the gathering, the soldiers, and the girl standing brave before them all. The final image showed the small figure surrounded by protective symbols, with paths leading in all directions, representing safe passage. Samuel explained that this was more than decoration. It was an official declaration from multiple Apache bands that Rose McCarthy was under their protection. Any Apache encountering her would offer aid if needed. The document served as a guarantee of safe passage through territories that would be dangerous for most settlers. It was an unprecedented honor, particularly for someone so young and from outside their culture. But Samuel also delivered a warning. This protection was real and would be honored, but it also made Rose a symbol. Symbols could be powerful, but they could also be targets. There would be those who resented what she represented, who saw her as either a traitor to her own people or a naive child being manipulated by savages. She would need to be wise about when and how to invoke the protection she had been granted. Nashota added his own words before departing. He told Rose that he had returned to his family, that his wounds had healed completely, and that he was able to hold his newborn daughter, a child born while he had been injured and hiding in those rocks. He said his daughter would grow up hearing the story of the brave girl who saved her father's life, and that this story would be passed down through generations. As Nashota rode away into the gathering darkness, Rose stood beside Thomas and Martha, the leather document case in her hands. She thought about the strange path her life had taken since that day at the auction when she had come to Canyon Ridge. She had lost her parents, found a new family, and somehow become part of a larger story about courage, compassion, and the possibility of understanding across seemingly impossible divides. The months that followed brought their share of challenges. Lieutenant Crawford never fully forgave what he saw as Rose's betrayal, and he made life difficult for the trading post whenever possible. Some settlers continued to view the Hendersons with suspicion for harboring someone who had aided the enemy. Business fluctuated with the political winds, and there were times when Thomas worried about their financial survival, but there were also unexpected gifts. The Apache women began trading with Canyon Ridge more regularly, bringing exquisite craftwork that Thomas could sell at premium prices in Tucson. Samuel Whitehorse became a frequent visitor and friend, bridging worlds with his translations and wisdom. Other traders who valued integrity over prejudice made special efforts to do business with the Hendersons, respecting their principled stance. Rose grew into her teenage years, carrying the weight and privilege of her unique position. She learned to navigate the complexities of being both protected and scrutinized, honored and resented. The turquoise stone remained around her neck, hidden but present, a reminder of choices made and connections forged in darkness and whispers. Years later, when historians and folklorists came to document the stories of the Arizona Territory, they would spend considerable time trying to separate fact from legend regarding the orphan girl and the gathering of hundreds. Some details had been exaggerated with retelling. Some had been simplified or romanticized, but the core truth remained undeniable and documented in multiple sources from various perspectives. A 10-year-old girl had found a wounded warrior and chosen compassion over fear. She had risked safety and security to show basic human kindness. And that simple choice had resonated so profoundly that hundreds had come not for war, but to honor her courage. In a time and place defined by conflict, suspicion, and violence, one child had proved that individual actions still mattered, that mercy was not weakness, and that the smallest voices could sometimes carry the furthest. The leather document case with its pictograph story remained in the Henderson family for generations, eventually finding its way to a museum where it sits today. Visitors stop to study the images, reading the placard that explains its significance. They see the small figure with red hair, the wounded warrior, the massive gathering and the protective symbols that surround them all. Some visitors dismiss it as quaint frontier mythology. Others stand before it for long minutes, trying to imagine the courage required of that young girl. But everyone who sees it is confronted with the same fundamental question that Rose McCarthy faced in those rocks outside Canyon Ridge. When you encounter suffering, especially when helping carries risk and the sufferer is supposed to be your enemy, what do you choose? Rose's answer, whispered in darkness to a wounded warrior, had been heard by hundreds, and the echo of that whisper continues to ask us all what we might choose when faced with similar moments. Because such moments still come in different forms and contexts, but always asking the same essential question about who we are and what we value more, our fears or our humanity. As the sun set over the Arizona desert on that long-ago day after the gathering, Rose had stood on the porch of the trading post, watching the last warriors disappear into the landscape. She had not known then how her story would be remembered or what ripples her choices would create. She had simply done what felt right in her heart. And sometimes, in a complicated world full of impossible choices and competing loyalties, that is the most any of us can do. Listen to the voice inside that knows compassion when it sees suffering, that chooses connection over division, that whispers courage when fear screams loudest. Rose McCarthy heard that whisper. She answered it. And hundreds came for her, not to destroy but to honor the truth that even in the darkest conflicts, one small light of kindness can illuminate more than we ever imagined possible.